PodSaaS, where we're putting the SaaS back in SaaSy. Sponsored by LeadrPro, where you can book demos with target customers on demand and fill your sales pipeline instantly.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of PodSaaS. I'm your host, Chris Sheng, and today we have Jay from Zeitworks coming to us from Seattle. How's it going?
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Of course, man. Before we jump into a series of rapid fire questions where our guests get to know you a little bit more as a startup founder, we'd love to know what Zeitworks is and ultimately who you guys service as an ideal customer.
Sure. So absolutely. So Zeitworks is a business process intelligence platform. And so what we do is we automatically measure and help improve business processes executed in all kinds of industries out there, like the financial services industries, in insurance, healthcare. There's lots of people out there moving information around from system to system as part of some business process. A lot of the insight into those business processes is lacking in many cases. And so Zeitworks measures those business processes as people do the work. And then we do a lot of analysis and use machine learning on the data we get to figure out where are there inefficiencies and where could there be improvements, both on the business processes and the teams as well.
Got it. And who do you guys sell into primarily?
We sell into a number of different verticals like financial services. I mentioned healthcare is a big area, insurance, basically any place where there are repetitive business processes, that are executed by operations teams.
Got it. Sounds good. Before we get into kind of like how you started that, we'll go into a series of rapid fire questions. So it's all pretty straightforward, but if you're up for it, we can get things started.
Yeah, please.
Sounds good. First question is super easy. Favorite entrepreneur and or startup story? And it can be one of the same or it could be different.
Okay, sure. This one's pretty easy. I mean, favorite entrepreneurs are Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Their computers changed my life in very positive ways. Those guys are icons and gods. So definitely my favorite entrepreneurs. Thinking about like who my favorite, my favorite startup story, I was reminded that a few months ago, I heard a podcast on Airbnb. And it was such a great story because, I love startup stories where people's reactions are, you're going to do what? That's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Not like sort of like, well, I'm not so sure about that idea, or that might work or it might not work, but where there's really kind of polarity around it being a dumb idea. And when those entrepreneurs persevere, they're awesome. I mean, people have egg on their face for criticizing them, et cetera. And so, I've had some startups like that where I was working on some ideas where I got very negative, dark reactions from people. Of course, when the startup turned out to be successful, some of those same people then were like, "Oh, that was of course you were successful with that. That was a great idea. I had that idea, I think." So I love that kind of David and Goliath, startup. Like, hey, this may sound stupid, but I think there's something really big here. And then people go and execute and make it happen. Those are great.
Yep, I agree. I love their story too. That's one of my favorites as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Next question here is, do you remember what you wanted to be as a kid, ages like 8, 9, 10 years old?
I do. I wanted to be a musician. I was a drummer when I was young, into rock music and blues and a little bit of jazz. And I was convinced I was going to be a professional musician. It's all I did. That's all I thought about. Interestingly, that music passion ultimately led me to computers and computer science. But that's another story. But yeah, wanted to play music.
Awesome. Next question here is around most painful experience, and this can be personal or professional, and I'll give you some context. But the idea is, I think a lot of our biggest places of growth stem from places of extreme discomfort. And so has there been any scenario, again, personal or professional, where at the time going through it, it was very difficult and trying, but you can look back on it now and realize that it was character defining to a certain degree?
Yeah, I mean, the things that come to mind are certainly around professional, struggles. So, I give a talk to young entrepreneurs who want to start machine learning companies and AI companies. And the essence of my talk is that, if you have a machine learning company, it's probably actually not a machine learning company, it's a data company. And the data you want often belongs to somebody else, and they don't want you to have it, or they may make you pay for it, et cetera. And so I've had some experiences in my career where I had a very data-driven machine learning application where the data ultimately belonged to someone else, and they decided at some point that they didn't like what we were doing with the data. And so there was a threat to cut off our supply of data. And of course, just like an engine, a machine learning engine, if you have no gas for your engine, then your car is not going to go anywhere. And so I can certainly remember a lot of sleepless nights and insomnia, worried about what was going to happen the next day and whether there was going to be a company. And that stuff was character building. I mean, it certainly helped me form my thesis around, how important data is to machine learning companies, even more so than the technology itself. And I certainly think hard when working on new ideas about how do you really procure data, for this startup. And as I've worked with younger entrepreneurs and advised lots of entrepreneurs, it's a theme that often comes up.
Got it. In those situations where kind of, you've been backed up against the wall, and obviously when you start a business, there's many times that you're feeling that, but is there anything particularly that motivates you in the 25th hour?
Like to keep going, you mean? Or
yeah, I mean, to keep going, because there's there's a lot of people who I think that's the difference maker for a lot of successful founders versus those aren't as successful, right? It's like the persistence.
Yeah. I mean, to me, doing a startup is a very creative endeavor. It's a lot of things, of course. It's risky, it's hard, it's challenging, there's long hours, but ultimately it's creative. And so you're creating something, usually something new, something that's innovative, something you believe in, maybe something that other people are criticizing, like I was saying earlier, and saying it was not a good idea. And so, that level of creativity, like this is my thing, this is my art, this is my mission, I think is certainly what's kept me going in a lot of hard times. Also, the allegiance to the people who you brought along for the journey, and really feeling strongly like I've got to make this great for them, as well as me, but probably more importantly for them. I've talked them into this. I've sold the mission to them. They bought into it, and so now we gotta go up this mountain, no matter how steep it is, to get to the top. Even though there may be rocks coming down on us, and all kinds of other analogies like that.
Got it. Okay, next question here would be, given that you've gone through some of these difficult moments, is there anything personally that you go to decompress? Maybe playing on the drums or something like that? I don't know.
Yeah, certainly I still play and guitar as well. So that's definitely a place I go to. Yeah, it can be hard. It can be hard to go to a place that's completely offline and off the grid. It can be challenging to get the business out of your head. When you're trying to be offline. So, like for example, I sometimes have had struggles just going on vacation. When in the early stages of leading these startups, because getting the business out of your head and living in the moment, like with your family when you're at the beach or something, it's challenging. It's challenging to let that stuff go. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely something that I need to continue to work on.
Fair enough. And as a founder, obviously, you wear a ton of different hats along the way. Has there been a skill set that you've picked up that you never thought that you would pick up, that you had a strong emotional disposition towards, loved or hated?
Well, I think that, one of my challenges that I feel sometimes is I'm a generalist. And even though I started out in technology and being a programmer and having a specialty there that was valued and sought after, over time, I've learned more and more different disciplines and put on more and more different hats. And I think that an important thing for early stage companies is that you have a group of people who are there to wear multiple hats. You can go to a big company and be told to stay in your own lane and all of those things. But when you come to a startup, you're probably underpaid, you're taking a bunch of risk. So you really should be getting the most out of the experience as you can, which means learning new things and challenging yourself. Putting yourself in dangerous situations and making yourself uncomfortable, I think we all know can be painful, but that's really where you grow and learn. And so, I always make sure in these earliest stages that everybody is wearing a lot of hats and they want to wear a lot of hats, even though, sometimes some of these hats can be, especially in certain moments, can be pesky or not what you want to think about at the moment. But I've enjoyed, not only having an engineering background and a technology background, but learning, marketing, sales, and accounting, and the mechanics of venture investing, and all of those things. Just like I've enjoyed learning multiple instruments. I didn't want to be just a drummer. I wanted to be a guitar player and a composer and a bass player and anything else I could pick up to make my own songs and do my own compositions. I like playing in a band, but there's times where I kind of want to play all the parts. And so I think that that's a lot of what attracts people to these early stages.
For sure. Next question is, what do you have a bucket list, number one, and number two, what's one of the more ambitious items on that bucket list?
Great question. I mean, I think I do have an itch I would like to scratch, which I'm kind of starting to scratch right now with a nonprofit, but importantly, a really early stage nonprofit. I have a friend who I've started to help his nonprofit in my copious free time. And it's very early on, it's very early, and I'm helping him with a number of things that are indicative of things that I've done in early stage startups, like around marketing and accumulating a user base and members and so forth. And so that's been a lot of fun. And I'd like to sort of continue to do things like that, as I get farther into my career, and maybe I'll do that full time for a while. So that's one thing I'm continuing to think about. Another thing on my bucket list, of course, is travel. Especially during the pandemic, I've really kind of been jonesing for more travel and going to far out places and interacting with new experiences and so forth. So that's definitely on my bucket list. And then I would say the last thing on my bucket list is to make a full circle. I would like to go back to programming at some point. I loved program. And as I got into management and leadership and startups and all of these kinds of things, started putting on all these different hats, and that's been very compelling and immersive. But the endorphin rush I used to get from programming is something I miss. And so I hope I can find an opportunity for myself later on in my career where maybe it's not super high stress or whatever, but I get back to where I started and doing that stuff.
Got it. Awesome. Last question here is the idea of legacy and what impact you want to leave on this earth before you leave it.
Yeah. I was always learning and I sort of never kind of settling for status quo. Also just being a very creative person. Those are all things that not only do I hope I'm remembered by, but I hope I've influenced my kids to do those things. I don't want them to be like reckless entrepreneurs who mortgage their house and get divorced over their entrepreneurial work and all those kinds of things. But I do think it's really important that we put ourselves in situations where we're learning and need to learn, and we're doing that because we love to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. That's pretty much what the rapid fire questions, but I think we got a lot of good nuggets in there in terms of understanding who you are a little bit more, Jay. And so love to talk about more along the lines of your journey to Zeitworks. So can you talk us through a little bit more about your like earlier work history, where you kind of like started laying out the foundation for your professional expertise, and then when did you start making the transition into the startup world?
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned, I started out as a programmer, and I got into programming through music. A lot of people think that there's a connection there with, a lot of technology people are music people too. And I don't know, at some point I made this crazy leap from playing music and using computers to compose music and produce music. I got this thing in my head one day that I could program the computer and make it do the things I wanted it to do. And a buddy of mine in college who knew more about this said, "You can't program. Programming's hard. Get a clue." But I've kind of figured it out, and I taught myself to program, and then eventually I changed my major to computer science, and the rest is history. And starting to work, I tended to gravitate towards small companies where there was just a lot more room for creativity and input. I didn't want to be told what to do. I wanted to be part of the conversation. And I think this sort of phrase of wanting a seat at the table is come up in my career, over and over again, and it sort of continues to help me expand my roles from, individual contributor to manager to vice president to CTO and now CEO. Mm-hmm. At one point, I had a serendipitous experience where I met some faculty at the University of Washington who were spinning out some of their research into the private sector with the help of venture capital. This was in the mid 90s, maybe mid to later 90s. So .com bubble was, just starting to inflate, and there was a lot of excitement around technology, information technology, and the web, and so forth. And that's really where I got hooked. Where we were able to build something and build it pretty quickly, and I was able to start playing leadership roles in that experience. And so from that, I got interested in machine learning technology, albeit in its nascent form in the late 90s compared to what it is now. And then, got interested in venture capital, got interested in being a co-founder, and the rest is history. I went on to co-found 4 companies, all very data and machine learning oriented. Some were for consumer benefit, some were for business to business benefit, and they all involved transparency, though, at some level, where we were using data and analytics to show people things that weren't available before. So, for example, one of the first company I co-founded was called Ad Relevance. And we were the first company to measure online advertising. And mind you, our measurements were crude at best, but at the time, nobody knew who was advertising what and where. It was a black box. It was opaque, and so our technology started to expose, what brands were showing up on what sites and at what frequency. And that ended up kind of being a theme, even though I bounced around from vertical to vertical. So the next company after that was called Faircast, also co-founded with University of Washington computer science professor, a guy named Oren Etzioni, who's well known in the machine learning and AI circles. He had the idea of predicting changes in airfare prices. Again, there was opacity there. You buy an airline ticket, you never know what the price is going to be, even though you might be traveling the same route. And so we use machine learning technology to figure out, is now a good time to buy, or should you wait until later to get a lower price? And so there's more stories there around that, but most of what I've worked on has been around unique data, usually challenging, noisy data, but real world data and technology and analytics to provide some level of transparency.
Interesting. And let's go back kind of to those early days of I know you got involved in, maybe it felt like a lot more organic than maybe it is nowadays, just given the environment with the tech boom and everything back in the mid to late 90s. But, for others that are kind of in where they're at now, maybe like other programmers or engineers where they have an idea that they want to go develop. I mean, can you walk us through kind of the learning curves of being a founder, and then ultimately your transition from programmer to like leadership, and what did that entail? What does that look like? Because I think, being able to walk somebody through tangible, almost like action item steps of like what you went through, and obviously now it's all kind of, that's all she wrote kind of deal. But when you went through it, obviously you were learning a tremendous amount at the same time of all the excitement of being involved in it.
Yeah. Well, today there's a lot of, topics I have knowledge and experience with, where back in the day there was, very little educational material about it. Today there's lots of educational material, whether it's about machine learning or, computing in various shapes and forms, or doing startups. There's many good books out there now. Some of them written by friends of mine that really kind of outline, like, this is what you need to do and this is how you need to think, to get going in a startup. And those are great books, and they're very useful. And I wish I had had some of those frameworks when I was getting started. But they're no guarantee. These things are really hard. And they just require a lot of effort and tenacity and luck and serendipity. And so, again, I think you used the right word when you said organic. Back in my early days, we were just sort of figuring out things as we went, and stumbling upon problems that inevitably happen. For example, choosing a co-founder. It's a really hard thing to do. To say that two people who are co-founders is like a marriage is not saying enough. It really requires a lot of patience and empathy and understanding, as well as sort of synergy and then shared energies and so forth. So, but again, there's a lot of resources out there to, stop and contemplate these things and think about them. There's also the same old challenges today that there were, 20 years ago. Like, is this a real problem? Is your solution a painkiller or a vitamin? That old adage. I think it's still very true. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't do their homework before they get started. And they come up with a creative idea that they feel passionate about, which is awesome. But then they go and execute. And then as they get far down the line, maybe after spending a lot of money and resources, they ultimately find Jesus is like, not really a pain that people have, or you name it, there are going to be lots of reasons.
Sure.
So I like that there's the structure out there now, the learning structure, environments and incubators you can join, and all of those things. But, it's still really hard. Yeah.
I mean, it still always boils down to, I think, like, there's so many situations where you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force them to drink it. And I think, like, when I say that, it's like I'm speaking more from, I do a lot of work with different VC firms and their portfolio companies, specifically like earlier stage, pre-seed, seed type of companies, where, you give them the playbook for go-to-market, or trying to give them the playbook for like building out a sales process and funnel, and it's still dragging their feet along the ways. And I remember, I think, like, as an early founder, being a lot more conservative in some facets because it was my own resources and my own time. But then at the same time, at some point or another, like, you kind of have to, and I don't know if every founder goes through this, but then your back's against the wall. You need to generate something. You need to generate the product, you need to generate revenue, you need to generate, customer success and happiness and retention, or whatever it is, and your back's against the wall. And then all of a sudden that conservativeness goes out the door and you start taking these chances. And I find that through these conversations that the founders that have found the things that worked well for them ended up being in one of those kinds of scenarios where, like, they're kind of like forced back against the wall, getting really, really creative with problem solving. Because when your livelihood is dependent upon it, then it makes a big difference. Have you ever been in a scenario like that? Or, you know, has there been any situation where you can think of where, like, again, back against the wall, but like, you're like, damn, that was fun. It was fun, and I learned a lot. I don't want to go back there for my health, but you know, is a really good experience to kind of go through, because I do think those are the character defining things that will shape a founder, you know, and help them with their empathy, help them with the way that they lead people, you know, and unless you kind of gone through those things. But most people won't put themselves in that kind of situation, is ultimately, I think, the thing.
Yeah. You know, one way to you know, vector at this is that I was in a situation a number of years ago where myself, I was VP of engineering, and a number of other VP level people were put together to figure out this company and run it. And we were very different kinds of people, and we weren't friends right off the bat. We really didn't understand each other. But the battle that we went through together, you know, it sounds cliche, but you know, being in the trenches with people, you know, it really shapes you. And today, those guys, we're all still very different, but we have a bond. You know, we were brothers in arms. And those kinds of relationships, I think, you know, you can spot them in the wild when people talk about how I was at so-and-so company early on, and you can see the kind of glimmer in their eyes when they talk about the early days, and that passion and bonding that happens is really cool. And I think you can probably find that at large companies on certain teams and so forth. So it's not that it's you only find that in startups. But when it works in an early stage startup, it can be very engrossing and endearing, and you know, those are people you'll always have a bond with.
Yeah, for sure. So tell us about like Zeitworks and how you got the inspiration for building this business. You saying being like your fourth startup that you've helped, or fifth? Okay.
So after I sold my last startup, my co-founders and I sold our last startup to Hulu. I was at Hulu. I sold companies a number of times, and then, you know, you work at the bigger company, the acquiring company for a while, and then, you know, you get the itch again, and the grass is always greener. And so where I went after Hulu was a close friend of mine. Recruited me to be CTO and managing director of a startup studio called Madrona Venture Labs in Seattle, funded by Madrona Venture Group, the largest VC firm in Seattle. And there was a small group of us, experienced operators and entrepreneurs, and our mandate, our charter was pretty cool. Think up new, interesting, venture-backable technology startup ideas. But importantly, do our homework on them.
Yeah.
And kill as many ideas as we can. Because again, I think that's the mistake that most entrepreneurs make. And so, you know, we would often get direction from Madrona Venture Group on spaces that they were interested in. And so one of the spaces in late 2018 was looking at the automation space, and specifically looking at RPA companies like UiPath, for example, a big RPA company. With some presence up here in the Pacific Northwest. And so my partner, Ben Elowitz, and I, one of my partners, Ben and I, started looking at the RPA space and doing our homework. And we talked to RPA vendors, and we kind of learned about their technology. And then we started talking with management consultants like the McKinseys and Deloittes of the world, who play a big role in helping organizations with their business processes. And then we talked to customers. You know, it's hard to talk to customers. A lot of entrepreneurs are like, well, my cousin, you know, is in this space. I talked to them. He told me what to do, or she told me what to do. But you gotta like go through the pain of getting on the phone with these people, and really listening. It's hard to listen when you've got a vision, but really listening about what the pain was, or is. And we talked with a lot of customers, and what we found was many of them were interested in this hot new automation space and automating a lot of their business processes, saving a lot of money. But what they told us was, you know, I don't know what my processes are, and I don't know what my people do. We may have had this written down at some point, but with changes in the business and attrition and people coming and going, I've got 20 people doing some business process, and I don't know who does it well or not so well, or which parts of the process need to be re-engineered. And so when we heard that, and we thought, we could solve this problem with technology by having a software agent that sits on the desktop machine and observes how people are interacting and performing their business processes, and then being able to give them analytics and feedback on how they do their jobs and their managers, how they do their jobs and where to improve. That's kind of where that came from. And again, it's about transparency. I got a group of people, I don't know what they do. Somebody tell me, somebody peel back the onion layers and show me what's really going on. They do that with data. And so that's what we do at Zeitworks. I didn't initially join as CEO. The company spun out of the lab, as did the other dozen companies or so I worked on inside Madrona Venture Labs. But eventually, the company came to an impasse where I wanted to get more involved and help. Even when I was working on companies within the lab, they still kind of felt like my babies in a way, even though you had to kind of hand them off and give them to the entrepreneurs to take them and run with them. So I was ready to operate again too. Kind of a source of pride for me. Just, it was interesting being an investor and an advisor and all these kind of high level roles. But at the end of the day, I like being down at the bottom, shoveling rocks with everybody else.
Yep. I feel you on that. Yep. Interesting. And so I'm going to kind of round things out here in a little bit, but how's the journey been with Zeitworks now, this 5th time go around, right? I mean, I know you have the itch that you wanted to scratch and you want to be down, shoveling the rocks again. But I mean, I'm on what, third startup now. And I mean, I know that it does get easier each time a little bit. I mean, and at least like the stresses don't wear on you as heavily as they did before. So even when things aren't working, I think, you have a little bit more calm about you than you did in your earlier days or the first few. But has there been any of those types of learnings that you found, through going this rigmarole like 5 times now, that some things that may never change, obviously, but maybe like your perception has changed, and that you could share with maybe like early stage founders that are maybe going through it right now and they're like under a high amount of stress and running around crazy, but that you can instill some calm about them where it's like it's gonna solve itself out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's I would say that yes, there's commonalities amongst the startups, and over time you learn to be more serene and calm and level-headed about the challenges. They're not as dramatic, even though they actually might be, but because you have experience with them. That said, I would also say that there's always new things. There's always new challenges. Like Zeitworks is, for all intents and purposes, an enterprise product. We have a SaaS component, a self-service analytics portal our customers use, but you have to install our software on an organization's machines. And so there's friction and challenges around that. But I do think that practice makes perfect. And I know there are lots of entrepreneurs out there who try this and they have a kind of a dramatic experience, and then they run back to the big company or whatever. And I would definitely encourage people to soak it in, learn as much as you can, and then try it again. After you exit the first one, then think about a second one. One of the things I've always said about my career is that every new experience is an antidote to the last experience. So if one experience was a consumer experience, then the next experience is going to be B2B. Or if we were doing one type of software in the previous experience, then I'm going to do a different type in the next experience, because you just want to shake it up and do something different. And make sure you're having the ups and downs of the sine wave. and going through the full wave. So
Yeah.
the enterprise part has been challenging for Zeitworks, but it's also new, and I'm learning a ton, and so it's all good.
Yeah. Cool. Last question here is going to be, where do you see yourself and or Zeitworks, collaboratively the next 5 years, right? And I think this question is a little bit more interesting given your kind of background, because I just had a conversation the other day with another entrepreneur who has exited, I think, like five or six companies at this point. And his mentality is very different now. It's almost reverse engineering from what's the goal. One of his first early exits was a unicorn, but he said at the end of the day he owned less than 1% of the company. And his most recent one, he was the only signature that needed to be on that piece of paper to sell the Gusto, essentially, and it was like one of the biggest outcomes he's ever had. So I'm curious as to now everything that he does is reverse engineering, looking at what the outcome he's looking for and then backing into it. But for you, what is the outcome here that you're looking for? Where do you want to be in the next 5 years with Zeitworks?
Well, it's always good to have options. And so, to whatever happens with Zeitworks, and I hope great things happen to it. And because we're venture backed, we do have a very big vision of what this could be. And so seeing that come to fruition would be very rewarding. All that said, I mean, I think the ride is really important in these. And if you are doing these to get rich quick and go sit on a beach, you're doing the wrong thing. This isn't the way to do that. There's probably more expedient ways,
of course,
to end up on a beach. So the ride is the journey. I think is really important. And again, even if you're just doing technology startups over and over again that are data and machine learning centric and blah blah blah. They're all different enough. They're all challenging enough. The world is constantly changing. The startups I did 20 years ago are not like the startups I'm doing now. The challenges are all much different. Some things are much easier. Some things are harder. So do it for the journey. Do it to learn and to grow. And if you're learning and growing, nobody can take that away from you. There's no stock options that are, going to get pulled out from under you or become worthless. You exit a better person. And so I would really encourage people to focus on that part.
Awesome. On that note, Jay, I want to say thank you for devoting your time to us today. It was definitely very, very beneficial and I think fruitful for our listeners to kind of hear your journey. So thanks for taking the time. I'm sure you're super busy. And yes, congrats on Zeitworks and all the work to date. And I can't wait to see where you guys end up in the next few years here.
Awesome. Yeah. No, thanks so much, Chris. Really appreciate being on.